Every single year for the past 7 years, rumors have swirled about Wind Waker HD and Twilight Princess HD ports heading to the Switch. And every time that hype train starts down the spirit tracks again, as much as I would like to see this pair of games show up on the system, there's actually another duo from Zelda history I start to wish for. Two games that are locked away in the silent realm of quirky 3DS hardware. That's right, I'm talking about the Ocarina of Time 3D and Majora's Mask 3D titles, two amazing remasters that I would hate to see lost to history, emulators aside, obviously. Now, honestly, I'm not even sure if I agree with my own opinion that these games need Switch ports more than Wind Waker HD and Twilight Princess HD. It's just that controversial, but this is definitely something we need to talk about, so mash that subscribe button and let's dive in. Now, let's get a couple things out of the way right now. First, I know Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask are available through Switch Online. We'll come back to that in a minute. Second, this video is by no means about how Wind Waker or Twilight Princess aren't that great. They really are. Wind Waker HD was maybe even my favorite Wii U game after Breath of the Wild. The art style of that game perfectly scaled to more powerful hardware and revamped lighting, and it's beautiful even today. The music and characters are still memorable, the dungeons are atmospheric, and the overworld, while a bit too big and sparse, is full of charm and adventure. A few smart quality of life improvements like faster sailing and a reduced Triforce quest even improved playability. This game definitely deserves a second, or rather third, life on a system that actually has, users. As for Twilight Princess, well, honestly, it very narrowly edges out Skyward Sword as my least favorite 3D Zelda, but I'd still like to see the HD remaster ported over. There's some fun dungeons and quests in this game, even if the art and graphics are still a bit bland and lifeless after the HD upgrade. I think a heavier overhaul could have really done wonders here, but alas. The world of Hyrule is also the least interesting of the 3D games for my taste, and the wolf segments are, well, something. But I'm not here to talk about Twilight Princess, that's a topic for another video. My main point is that with this pair of Wii U titles, we have one awesome game and one so-so game, but we'll say things average out to an overall quality set. Ocarina of Time 3D and Majora's Mask 3D, on the other hand, these are some heavy hitters. I think most gamers have forgotten what a substantial upgrade these games were over the originals in terms of graphics and quality of life features. I would argue that these remasters were every bit as significant as Wind Waker HD was to the original, maybe even more so. These remasters bring the N64 games forward almost an entire generation to be closer to what you might see on GameCube. The frame rate was stabilized and greatly improved, pre-rendered blurry backgrounds were removed, character models were overhauled, texture quality and resolution were increased, particle effects were improved, enemy designs enhanced, and even some animations were reworked. These were surprisingly substantial overhauls to classic games. And that's not even counting the 3D visuals, which add impressive depth, though I always found the 3D effect to be too finicky to deal with for more than short periods. Unfortunately, I don't have direct feed capture for my unmodded 3DS, but hopefully this video still gives you an idea. Now, I still remember the first time I booted up Ocarina of Time through Switch Online, and I was a bit shocked to rediscover what it looked like. You see, I hadn't played the original version of this game in well over a decade because the 3DS version had become my new standard. I had started to take for granted what a sizable upgrade that really was, and the same applied to Majora's Mask. But it wasn't just the visuals, it was everything. There are a ton of quality of life improvements in both Ocarina of Time 3D and Majora's Mask 3D that are rough to live without once you've experienced them. For example, you no longer have to go through a series of slow menus to equip or unequip different boots, a major pain point in the infamous water temple where you change them constantly. Arrow types are easier to select, inventory items can be rearranged, the HUD was greatly minimized thanks to the second screen, and additional hints were added to guide players through more cryptic sections. Both games also featured improvements to the Ocarina instrument controls and interactive songs. Majora's Mask featured arguably even more significant changes since it was always the more quirky and unforgiving of the two games. This update included minor tweaks to the time management system, further menu updates such as the Bomber's Notebook changes, added save stations in some unforgiving segments, tweaked behaviors and appearances for some characters and assets in Clocktown, and even support for a second analog stick to control the camera, if you had the new 3DS hardware model. Some of these changes came with some controversy. For example, some boss fights and mask effects were adjusted a bit. And the changes didn't stop there. Both games feature new content in the form of boss rush modes, and Majora's Mask even added a new side quest, which is kind of crazy to think about since it released 15 years after the original. I don't even know why this was added in. There's tons of quests in the game to begin with. Anyway, there are plenty of other very minor changes I haven't listed here, such as the placement of certain items throughout the games. These really were significant remasters, and they could go even further on Switch. We could have full 16:9 widescreen support with 1080p resolution and 60 FPS. The second screen menus could be reworked to a more traditional Zelda UI. All of the graininess could be removed to show the bright colors of these remasters, which are notably more vivid than the originals. Ocarina of Time released around the launch of the 3DS when the user base was small, but it did go on to be a bestseller for the system with around 6 or 7 million copies supposedly sold. Majora's Mask released a couple years later when the system was starting to gain a little more momentum, but the 3DS was never really the resounding success that the Switch was. And that's a shame because these are really the best versions of two of the best Zelda games ever made. It would be great to see these titles on a system with a giant user base like the Switch. I think these could sell incredibly well yet again. So this leaves the question of which pair of games deserves a Switch port more: remasters of the GameCube Zelda games or remasters of the N64 games. I would guess that most will say the GameCube games because we already have the original N64 versions available with Switch Online, and that's obviously a solid argument. However, if I had to pick based on the quality of the games themselves and what the remasters bring, I do slightly prefer the N64 generation Zelda games over the GameCube, even if Wind Waker will always have a special place in my gamer heart. For that reason, it's really hard for me to be at peace with the idea of losing these excellent N64 remasters to history. Obviously, they are available through emulators, but again, I'm disregarding that unofficial outlet for the sake of argument. As a side note, I think it's also bizarre how many similarities the 3DS Zelda remasters have with the Wii U remasters. Both pairs of games received moderate graphical updates and quality of life improvements to bring them forward almost a generation. Both utilized dual screen setups to improve the UI and menu management, whether that's two dedicated handheld screens or a gamepad screen. Both pairs are locked away on two of the most quirky or obscure Nintendo hardware systems. In both pairs, the first entry is arguably more popular than the second game, though each fan has their favorite. And both pairs had their individual titles quickly released within a couple years of each other. So in a perfect world, we'd receive all four games, but I just don't see that happening. We may not receive any of them. Nintendo DS and 3DS games seem to exist in sort of a weird limbo at Nintendo. The company never seems to talk about them much or discuss ports for those games. I mentioned this a bit in my retrospective of Samus Returns, another classic from a different franchise locked away on 3DS hardware. I'm sure the dual screen games are more difficult to port because they require gameplay or UI updates to rework to a single screen, but hey, so do Wii U games most of the time, and we've received plenty of those. Nintendo talks about its legacy Game Boy line of games all the time, but DS and 3DS are rarely mentioned, despite being more recent. So what do you think? Which pair of games would you rather see on Switch? Are Wind Waker and Twilight Princess still the obvious choice, or do you appreciate the 3DS remasters as much as I do? Ideally, we'd get these one at a time, so you could just pick, for instance, Ocarina of Time and Wind Waker HD, but I doubt that will happen. Will we see any of these games ported to a current or future Nintendo system? Please hit subscribe and leave a comment, and let's discuss. I think this is a really interesting topic, and I can't wait to see how it plays out. Thanks so much for watching.